A king dies screaming. His skin turns black. His priests say the gods are angry. His physicians say nothing, because they have no answer. This wasn't ignorance. This was every civilization on earth, at some point, looking at disease and seeing punishment. In 1347, ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. Most of the sailors on board were dead. The ones still alive were covered in black swellings oozing blood and pus. The port authorities ordered the ships out immediately. It was already too late. Within 5 years, somewhere between a third and half of Europe's entire population was gone. 50 million people. Maybe more. And nobody, not a single scholar, priest, or physician, could explain why. What they landed on was punishment. God was angry. The planets had aligned wrong. Jews were poisoning wells. Flagellant mobs marched through cities whipping themselves bloody, hoping public suffering would satisfy divine judgment. It wasn't cruelty. It was desperate logic. When death moves that fast and that randomly, the only framework that makes it survivable is meaning. And meaning, in the medieval mind, meant sin. The disease was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas on rats. It had nothing to do with morality. It didn't care if you were devout or wicked, rich or poor, clean or filthy. But the church taught that the world was morally ordered, that suffering followed transgression. The Black Death broke that contract so violently that some historians argue it single-handedly cracked the foundations of medieval Christianity. And here's what's genuinely fascinating about this. The curse interpretation wasn't entirely irrational. People could see that the disease spread person to person. Some cities that quarantined early survived better. A few observers correctly guessed contagion. But without germ theory, without microscopes, without any concept of microorganisms, there was no mechanism to hang the observation on. So the supernatural filled the gap. It always does, when the gap is wide enough. The Black Death eventually burned itself out, then returned repeatedly for the next 3 centuries. Every time it came back, the curse framework came with it. Because the alternative, that invisible living things were killing you and there was nothing a priest could do, was, in many ways, more terrifying than divine wrath. Leprosy does something most diseases don't. It destroys you slowly, visibly, and in public. Fingers shorten. Skin thickens and ulcerates. Facial features distort. Sensation disappears. And you live, sometimes for decades, in a body that is visibly coming apart. Every major civilization that encountered it called it a curse. In ancient India, it appeared in the Atharva Veda as divine retribution. In ancient Egypt, Greek physicians described it as a punishment specific to certain races. In the Hebrew Bible, Zerath, often translated as leprosy, rendered a person ritually unclean, requiring exile from the community and a declaration from the priest, not the physician. That detail matters. Leprosy was categorized as a religious problem before it was categorized as a medical one. The leper's bell, the small handbell medieval sufferers were required to ring as a warning, wasn't just a public health measure. It was a spiritual announcement. I am contaminated. I have been marked. Lepers were legally declared dead in some parts of medieval Europe. Priests would perform a funeral rite over a living person. They were lowered symbolically into a grave and told they no longer existed in the eyes of the law. Their property transferred to heirs. Their marriages dissolved. They became ghosts, people the community could see but was forbidden to touch. The disease is caused by Mycobacterium leprae, a slow-moving bacterium that targets the nervous system and skin. It is, by modern standards, one of the least contagious diseases known. Prolonged close contact is generally required for transmission. The fear was catastrophically disproportionate to the actual risk. But the appearance of leprosy mimicked, perfectly, what a medieval person would imagine a curse to look like. Progressive. visible, disfiguring, no obvious trigger, no cure, and the fact that it seemed to skip families, appearing in strangers and beggars, reinforced the idea that it was moral rather than biological, that something the person had done had invited this transformation. Hansen's disease, as it's properly called today, is fully curable with a course of antibiotics. There are roughly 200,000 new cases diagnosed annually. In many parts of the world, the stigma, the echo of the curse, outlasts the bacteria by generations. Hippocrates wrote a text called On the Sacred Disease. The disease in question was epilepsy, and his entire argument was that it wasn't sacred at all, that people only called it that because they didn't understand it. He was furious about this. He wrote it around 400 BCE, and he was already fighting a centuries-old consensus. Epilepsy produces something almost impossible to witness without a framework. A person is standing, talking, completely ordinary, and then they're on the ground, convulsing, eyes rolled back, making sounds that don't correspond to language. It lasts minutes. Then they wake up confused, often with no memory of what happened. No wound, no illness, no explanation. In ancient Mesopotamia, a detailed medical text called the Psychica cataloged epilepsy as spirit possession. Different types of seizures corresponded to different demons. The treatment was religious, incantations, rituals, amulets. In ancient Rome, epilepsy was called the commitial disease because a seizure during public assembly could cancel the entire meeting. It was a divine omen powerful enough to halt government. Julius Caesar had epilepsy. So, probably, did Alexander the Great. This created a theological contradiction. If seizures were demonic possession, why were the most powerful men in the world having them? The answer some cultures landed on was the opposite of curse. Seizure as divine contact, the God speaking directly through a human body. The same symptom meant punishment in one context and prophecy in another. In medieval Europe, epilepsy was associated with demonic possession with deadly seriousness. People who had seizures were brought to exorcists. Some were killed. The connection to witchcraft and supernatural corruption meant that treatment by a physician was considered almost beside the point. The body was just the vessel. The soul was the target. Epilepsy is caused by abnormal electrical activity in the brain. It is neurological, not supernatural, and it affects roughly 50 million people worldwide. Effective anticonvulsant medications exist. Surgery can eliminate seizures entirely in certain cases. But in 2025, in numerous countries, people with epilepsy still face legal restrictions on driving, marriage, and employment, not because of the disease's actual limitations, but because of a 3,000-year-old cultural memory of the curse. When syphilis appeared in Europe at the end of the 15th century, every country immediately named it after someone else. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. The Italians called it the French disease. The Russians called it the Polish disease. The Poles called it the German disease. The Japanese called it the Chinese pox. Nobody wanted to own it, because owning it meant you were the cursed one. The disease arrived in epidemic form around 1495, tearing through armies and cities with a ferocity that modern syphilis doesn't display. Early-stage syphilis in that era produced horrific skin eruptions, bone pain so severe people couldn't sleep, and death within months in some cases. It seemed to arrive from nowhere, and it spread in ways that were simultaneously obvious and unspeakable, because the primary vector was sex. This is where the curse interpretation became not just cultural but weaponized. Religious authorities across Europe had an immediate and coherent explanation: divine punishment for fornication. The disease mapped so perfectly onto the sin, transmitted through the act itself, that it seemed almost designed as a moral lesson. Preachers described it from pulpits. Medical writers who privately suspected it was a natural disease still published texts framing it as God's judgment, Because the alternative was every civilization looked at disease and saw meaning. Sometimes that meaning was wrong in catastrophic ways. The science changed. The stigma didn't always follow. If you found this useful, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.